Welcome back to another episode. And tonight we're going to be discussing hermeneutics. What I've been reading this week is primarily Gadamer and a couple of supporting texts. One I've discovered I'd like to recommend very highly is a book called Hans-Georg Gadamer, Philosophical Hermeneutics, translated and edited by David E. Lange, Linge. And I discovered that the editor's introduction was just very well written. And it seems like it's actually served as kind of a basic source texts for other people to write about Heidegger, because some other texts that I've run into sound kind of similar to what he has to say. So I want to give some props to this guy for having put together a text that a lot of people seem to be going back to. Now, the way I'd want to structure tonight's discussion is to begin by talking about, first of all, the difference between trying to discover meaning in a conversation or an intention of a speaker in a conversation versus trying to understand or discover meaning or intent in a text, and then use that discussion to bridge into Heidegger's ideas about how to go about interpreting a text or a work of art, and the truth that may or may not be accessible within the framework of a work of art or a text. And then perhaps even lead into a little bit of stuff about the value of the humanities over the sciences and where the humanities can access something of real value that the sciences have trouble reaching. So, to begin with, let's talk about conversations. Let's talk about conversations, intentions, and meaning. If we go back to Habermas, we find him giving us some validity conditions for doing just that, for being able to understand someone in a conversation, in the sense that we've grasped what they meant or intended. So the four conditions are it must be, the utterance must be understandable. T, it must be true. S, the speaker must be sincere. 4, the speech act is right or appropriate for the circumstance. So these are the 4 validity claims that go into being able to say that one has grasped whatever it was that the speaker meant when someone was speaking. So whatever the speaker said has to be understandable. It has to be put out in an assertoric fashion, so stated as something true, as opposed to just stated ironically, I suppose, or something that is false. The speaker should be sincere, and the speech act should be right or appropriate to the circumstance. The thing is, oftentimes, if people are coming to a discussion of intention or meaning in a speech act from the standpoint of having studied English literature, they might be already quite familiar with the idea that we can't always rely upon the intention of the author to determine exactly what a text means. Sometimes an author may not have had even a clear idea of what they intended in mind when they created their text. And the same thing might be true of a painter or a musician, in trying to divine someone's intention or what they meant in those circumstances is something that, at least for Gadamer and for a lot of people who followed after the new critics, is something that we can just throw out in our attempt to understand a work of literature, a painting, a piece of artwork. But when it comes to a conversation, for somebody like Habermas, given certain conditions like the sincerity of the speaker in meaning something, of having an intention behind their words, if you suppose that that really is there, that's one of the conditions, along with the utterance being understandable and appropriate, for someone to understand in the sense that they're grasping what was meant. So it's not as though this prohibition of going after an intention is just altogether prohibited when it comes to understanding somebody's attempt to communicate something. And another angle where we can approach this is through Wittgenstein. Now, Wittgenstein has a lot of passages, in philosophical investigations where he rails against psychologism. He talks in deplorable terms about trying to peer into somebody's mind as a way to understand what someone said or meant. And the tradition that goes back to Aristotle has it that, when we say something, our words are an attempt to express an idea that's in our mind. And when you write those words down, the written text is a further adumbration of the idea that was in somebody's mind. So we have the idea, we have the expression, and then we have the written text. And the way that expression through speech differs from writing something in a text is that in a live situation, you can ask the speaker, or the speaker can correct someone according to whether they have the right interpretation. And for Wittgenstein, this kind of verifying or figuring out or correcting what was meant by the speaker comes down to a way of acting that shows that one has understood. So this is a way to avoid trying to get into somebody's head, and instead allows us to kind of in a behavioristic way, look at somebody's actions and see if they correspond to what the other person intended. So, for example, in the case of somebody who's learning math, somebody can go up to a chalkboard, they can start teaching math, and if the student knows how to work out the problem and follow all the steps, then we say that objectively they have understood what was meant. They understood what was intended. They knew how to proceed. And when that breaks down, when somebody hasn't understood what was meant, there's a case where somebody feels as if they, quote, don't know their way about, or someone doesn't know quite how to go on. And here we can even bring in the chess metaphor or the chess analogy. So in order to play the game of chess, you have to know how to move the pieces. And to play the game well, you know how to move the pieces in a strategic way and in particular circumstances. And you can think of each of those moves as moves in a game of communication, in a game of conversation. The only way that the whole thing makes sense is for somebody to be making moves according to a set of pre-established rules. So the rules are very important as a touchstone. There's a way of behaving, there's a way of acting, there's a way of going on that indicates that somebody has understood what was meant. And another very, very basic example is the one that Philosophical Investigations opens up with, where we have two people on a building site, and one person says to the other, slab. Now, taken out of context, just the word on the printed page, slab, might be taken to mean all sorts of things. Like we're given enough information to know that slab is some sort of block, some sort of building material. Given that we're told that we're in the environment of a building site and we have two people here, so slab might be a command. Slab might be an ironic remark. It could mean all sorts of things. It could be some kind of slang that they've developed. And there's an indeterminacy there. But what helps to ensure that the person to whom the word slab is addressed has understood what was meant, has understood the intention of the speaker, is that the person does something that confirms it. So when one person says to the other slab, the other one goes and picks up a slab and puts it on top of some other piece of building material, a block. And when he does that, his behavior shows that he's understood. So just like in the case of doing math, just as it was in the case of the building material and the builders, and in the case of the chess match, there is built into the idea of understanding somebody's intent, a certain sort of behavior that certifies that one has understood, that amounts to following a rule. So comprehension, understanding, intention, those things can be ascertained in a live setting where people can correct one another. They're ascertained through a certain way of following a rule that occurs. Okay, so all of that is just said to point out that there is quite a difference between trying to discern someone's intent in a live situation, in a situation where you're having a conversation or a dialogue with somebody, and in a case where you're dealing with a text. And this is really where Gadamer comes in. Because what Gadamer says, or what he starts to emphasize for the first time in the history of the hermeneutical tradition, that starts with Schleiermacher, goes to Dilthey, goes to Heidegger, and then goes to Gadamer, is that we have to take into account the situatedness of the person who's looking at the work of art, or the reader of the text, or the listener to a piece of music, to grasp how it is that understanding occurs between the person experiencing the art and the artwork itself. Because there's no way for somebody to certify through the artwork itself that somebody is behaving in a way that shows that they've understood the intention of the artist. I mean, one possible way that could occur is an author writes a text, a critic sits down and writes an interpretation of the text, and their writing of that text could be taken to show that they've understood what the text meant. But in fact, when the author writes down the text, the openness to understanding that the text has surpasses even the author's intent. The text can mean all sorts of things besides what the author might have intended. And as I was pointing out earlier, the author, in many cases, is not even entirely sure what they meant. And sometimes the text even means more than the author intended when the author takes a look at what they actually said. So for Gadamer, the most important idea is that there is a situatedness to the interpreter of the work of art, or the interpreter of the message that's coming through the work of art. And that situatedness is a historical situatedness. So somebody who is approaching Shakespeare in the 21st century is going to be approaching Shakespeare in a different way than somebody in the 17th century or the 19th century. We are coming to the text with different frameworks of interpretation. And what's going on is that in our encounter with the text, we enter it already, in a sense, formed our way of being directed to the text insofar as what we find in it. Our directedness to the text is shaped by certain historical forces, certain ideas and values that we may not even realize we have, that provide a direction to our reading, provide a direction to our interpretation of the text. So one other remark I'll make about this is just that when it comes to Gadamer's place vis-a-vis some of the earlier interpreters like Schleiermacher and Dilthey, the emphasis was far more upon taking a look at the text as a kind of object. But what Gadamer does, and what Heidegger, I believe, starts to do before Gadamer, is to treat the text less like a kind of object that a scientist would be able to deal with, analyze, interpret in a kind of way that gives it objectivity. And what Heidegger and Gadamer do is go ahead and embrace a more subjective way of encountering the text, so that one's own subjective experiences encounter a world that the artist has given through the work of art. And these two worlds coincide. And this idea, I think, has been a very formative one in the way that art has come to be created in our postmodern era. A few episodes prior to this one, I was putting out the idea that the postmodern work of art is one that is created with the idea in mind that the way that a work of art means something is not going to be it's not going to be able to take advantage of some kind of meta narrative, some sort of framework of understanding that you might have in a situation where you have a sacred text or a sacred piece of artwork that you encounter in a church, where the institutional factors surrounding the work of art have invested a lot in giving a stable way to frame the images within that artwork and their meaning and what the significance that they're supposed to have in at least the broad outline terms. But in the postmodern situation, we can't rely on those meta narratives as a stable source of conveying meaning. And so art becomes something more localized. It becomes something more like a conversation between the artist and the person encountering the work of art. So now what I want to do is pivot to discussing truth in art. And I must say, Heidegger and Gadamer both have this idea that truth can be encountered in a work of art through and certified as being true on the basis of a psychological process that sounds a lot like the process of discovery. So they talk about the work of art or the text as disclosing itself to someone, to an interpreter, to an audience member. Something is disclosed, something is unconcealed. And Heidegger, in particular, is the one who formulates this idea. And this is the phenomenological experience of truth. And what he's doing there is he's describing a psychological state. So, in the moment of the discovery of truth, something is disclosed to the person who comes to see it. And what is being disclosed or unconcealed is the real being of the thing. And that is what truth amounts to. There is a sense of is that coincides with truth. And what he wants to get at there is there's a way that we can encounter something so that it reveals what it is to us. And in that moment, it's a moment of discovery, is the way I would put it. So it involves a psychological state. And I think an objection that has to be met, and I'm not sure if Heidegger has met it elsewhere, or there have been defenders of Heidegger who have anticipated this, but it just seems to me that a psychological state like discovery, no matter how convincing it might be, is not sufficient to certify that something is true. Because certainly there have been times throughout history when people have felt like they discovered something, that something had been disclosed to them, only to later discover that they were deceived in some way or other. Perhaps the details of the calculation they were working out weren't all entirely clear in their mind until they went back and looked at what they were doing a second time. And then they realized where their mistake was. It's not uncommon at all to feel like one has discovered something only to later find that one was mistaken. But I think what one can say is that that sort of psychological state does seem to be necessary for the feeling that one has encountered the truth. Okay, so it would be a necessary but not a sufficient condition. And when it comes to encountering something in a work of art, this becomes a little bit more problematic. So we watch a play, we read a book, we listen to John Coltrane, and we feel like we've understood something. We feel like we have had something communicated to us. We feel like something has been disclosed to us about the being of the thing that we have encountered. But in fact, without a way to actually certify that, I think we're left a little bit at sea. But I don't think that this should drive us to despair. This is sometimes the place where people begin to say that, and obviously this is where the sciences supersede the humanities, because in the sciences we can stay with this objective thing and we can verify on the basis of our continued experience with it, whether or not what we have said is true. And in the humanities, it doesn't look like we have some sort of stable referent in a text that we can grasp and say, this is the object, this is the thing that is true. But what I want to say, and what I think Gadamer and Heidegger would probably want to say, and I think they would probably agree, is that there is a whole field of human values, human relationships, and things like psychological health, the way to live a good life, that is covered in the subjectivity of the humanities in a way that it's very difficult to get at through the scientific research of all of these measurable things in the world. So even if, when we're reading a text like William Faulkner or Shakespeare or whoever it is, when we open that text, we enter into a dialogue, as Gadamer says. We're not entering into an investigation of something. We're entering into a dialogue. And that dialogue has to be maintained so that the work that one is encountering really becomes one's own, in a sense. We're kind of bringing those ideas home to ourselves. We make the text our own when we enter into that dialogue with the text. And a dialogue is a process of discovery. It's a process of discovery that is different than the sort of discovery that you would have in the field of the objective sciences. And when we feel like we've made that discovery, it seems to me that the kind of knowledge that we're getting is a kind of practical knowledge, as opposed to a knowledge of things in the world. And that practical knowledge has a very high value. These things like psychological health, things like figuring out how to live one's life well, what to do in a particular situation, those sorts of things have a way of orienting us in the world that you could argue supersedes what the objective sciences are able to do. As we go about in life, we have to have some idea of where we want to go and what we want to do, and that impacts the sorts of values that we have. As we go steering ourselves around, we feel like we need some more ultimate sense of direction. And if we can grasp what that is, we can give ourselves a deeper sense of meaning for our life, value for our life. And it's especially important that we discover it for ourselves. So we discover it for ourselves when we enter a dialogue with the text. So that's what I want to suggest insofar as where the humanities can find themselves in a place to, find their true value as opposed to the more objective theoretical sciences. And with that, I'll say goodnight.